Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Vardarajan and my guest today for our discussion is Ujjal Dosanjh, Canadian writer, politician, thinker. You, sir, were Premier of British Columbia of BC, perhaps the first Indian origin politician to head a Canadian province. Subsequently, again as part of the Liberal Party, you were Health Minister and a well-known figure in Canadian politics, and I dare say one of the better-known faces in India today when it comes to the Indian diaspora at the international level. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Rajya Sabha TV.
Good to be with you.
You have recently authored a book, Journey After Midnight, which in a way captures your own life experience. You were born perhaps around the time, shortly before India became independent, and you migrated in the 60s as a young man and lived your entire life abroad. Your life, as it were, as an adult in particular, could be read in some ways as a microcosm of the Indian diasporic experience, although you've had a very unique trajectory in politics. Perhaps a very small percentage of Indian migrants enter politics and achieve any degree of success in it. But let's go back to the 60s. What was the India you left? What are the reasons why you and your family decided that migration was the way forward? Give us a sense of that India in the 60s.
Well, India of the 60s was still India of the afterglow of the independence, and still rising expectations that India was going to go places. But you also knew that the rot had already set in terms of corruption and sifarish and all of those bad things.
Now you grew up in Punjab, right?
I'm
right.
talking about Punjab.
Okay.
I had not traveled outside of Punjab
right.
Before I left for England in 1964. And my father was an activist, ultimately with the Congress Party from before independence. And my nana, my grandfather, maternal grandfather, was a communist that had traveled the Gurdwara Sudhar movement to Kirti Kisan Party to CPI, and including a stint in the Babur Akali movement. And so I had experiences with politicians of different shades coming and visiting both households. And I was aware of the kind of tensions that existed in India, where people wanted more progress, expected more progress, wasn't happening, and people like me who were then students, I was in pre-engineering. I felt the sting of poverty. My family wasn't rich. My father and his brother owned 5 acres of land in Dosanjh, and we had about 12 mouths to feed in a joint family. And I wanted to go to a particular college and wasn't allowed to do that.
Because of fees?
Because of fees and costs, and I became less interested in science and more interested in politics.
Okay.
Reading the Blitz of the time.
So back in the day, did you take after your communist grandfather or your Congress father?
More after my communist grandfather.
I would imagine.
There's more rebellion in that,
right.
And I felt very constrained in the poverty and the like, and I found a way of getting admission to a college in London. Behind my father's back. He found out right at the end when the admission came.
And scholarship was not an issue?
No. There was wasn't. It was just I got admission to go, but I needed money to go.
Right.
Then he agreed to scrounge around and find me a plane fare, which was expensive in those days. And I ended up in England, didn't go to that school, started working and doing night school. So I went from an India which had kind of, whose growth had been stunted in a sense. I mean, there was this push and rush of development, but by 63, 64, people were beginning to feel disappointed. And
now you left in 64?
Yeah.
Now some would say, looking back, that you lived through the golden era of the Nehruvian economy, Nehruvian leadership, yet the way it touched your life at the base, the picture that was presented was not something that you
The
that
picture,
was very encouraging for you?
Well, the reality was different.
Okay.
The aspirations were obviously quite different from the reality.
Right.
And Nehru represented those aspirations, but we knew on the ground that it wasn't happening. And perhaps the sense of idealism I still may have comes from those days, the Nehru days.
Right. But you know, I suppose great things were being created at the national level, but you know, in terms of people's day-to-day lives, there was still nothing much that was happening.
Well, there was sort of, you know, the beginnings of the Green Revolution. I mean, Punjab was very fertile, very productive. I mean, we could live on 5 acres of land with 250 rupees a month that my father earned as a school teacher as well. But things weren't great, and I left more out of the constraints and the limitations I felt in my personal life vis-a-vis my father and the poverty that we had, not necessarily as a rejection of the country, because I've loved India always. And
now you arrive in London as a young man of 18, 19, and this is in London or some other place?
No,
in the UK?
I landed in London, but I went to Bedford,
okay.
which is about 60 miles.
So what was your experience? What was the kind of society that you encountered? Was there racism? We know, for example, from the experience of Afro-Caribbean migrants immediately after World War II that there was quite a bit of racism that they encountered. We know that Indians after the great Ugandan exodus also encountered. But what was England like in the 1960s for a young man like yourself?
Well, there wasn't that much of a population of Indians there at that time. There was a smattering of population in places like Birmingham, Bedford, Derby, London. But there weren't hundreds of thousands of Indians at that time. There was discrimination. I mean, my own cousin, who I joined, had faced discrimination, and he was told to cut his hair and his beard to get a job. And he was a very secular Sikh, and that turned him into a more of a religious Sikh. And he said, "No way, I'd rather die." And you know, when I roamed the streets of Bedford, I had experiences which were overtly racist.
Physical threats?
Yes, yes. And Baki, go home, and we were all sort of looked at. The teddy boys of the day would call every Indian or Pakistani a Paki.
Right, and the response that you would get from British law enforcement of the day?
I don't believe the community was as integrated or as active so as to complain about these things. They would go on because they were there to make a living, get some money, send some money home. There were fights. I mean, there's the Indian Workers Association was beginning to get active and raise issues, but there were very few activists on the ground in various towns and cities. I set up the first Indian Association in Bedford. I didn't know Mahatma Gandhi had done Young something. It was Young Indians Association in Bedford to try and deal with some of these issues in Bedford. Right.
And what led to your decision to move from England to Canada?
Well, you know, I had done various jobs. I was a crayon maker. I was a car parts maker. I was.
So you didn't really study actually when you?
No, I went to night school.
Okay.
I went to night school because I didn't have the money to go to full-time school. And I went to night school, did some O-levels, and did all of these jobs as a trains shunter as well. I wanted to go to university, couldn't get admission. There was no resources. I didn't want to ask my cousin, who had a family of his own, to support me. And the admission was somewhat harder in those days. My qualifications didn't automatically translate into admission. And so I was feeling constrained once again in my life. And then Enoch Powell happened. He made the Rivers of Blood speech. And that came as I was disenchanted already, and I applied to the Canadian High Commission to get immigration. My aunt was there. I had read about Canada, and they accepted me, and I headed off, hopefully to a brighter future.
So when did you arrive in Canada? I mean, which
May of '68.
'68, okay. Yeah. And this was to Vancouver.
Vancouver,
right? And how did the entry into politics happen? Because this is I would imagine today we read a lot about Indians in the United States or Canada, or even the United Kingdom, who are actively involved in politics. And you see a lot of Indian faces. I mean, Nikki Haley is going to be Donald Trump's UN ambassador, and she was earlier governor. Bobby Jindal is governor. But in the late 60s, early 70s, to think of a career in politics would have been something quite unusual for an Indian migrant, or did politics come to you later?
Well, it really, one thing followed another. It wasn't, there was no plan. I mean, there was no master plan for me to become an MLA. Never had dreamed to run. I was working, as I got to Canada, I worked in a lumber mill, became a member of the International Woodworkers of America, became somewhat of a part-time union organizer as well, and became a member of the center-left New Democratic Party.
So you started off with the NDP?
Yes, as a trade unionist, after hanging out with the Maoists of Herdale Baines variety for about 6 months. Right. I had, during that period, we worked on the issues of equality, discrimination, human rights, janitorial workers' rights, farm workers who had no rights, who were essentially in master-slave relationship. We worked on those issues, and domestic workers, the nannies, they had no legislative protections either. They were essentially in a master-slave relationship. Right. Those two issues, the nannies issue and the farm workers issues, we worked on very consistently and systematically for several years. As I had gone back to full-time education after I had injured my back, and so, I was an activist first and foremost, and a student. And once I became a lawyer, I had been a member of the political party and a volunteer for them. And in 1979, the first election after I became a lawyer, the constituency came calling and said, "Look, we've noticed you rebel rousing, and we would like you to consider running for us." Mm. That's how it began. Right. And
so you studied at UBC or Simon Fraser?
I did my BA at Simon Fraser and my law at UBC.
Okay. Now, British Columbia is an interesting province from an Indian point of view.
Absolutely.
Because pretty much the entire west coast of North America, this was a magnet for Indian and Chinese immigrants going back 100, 150 years. And Vancouver was also the scene of the emotionally wrenching Kamagata Maru incident, when Indians tried to circumvent laws that the Canadians had made in order to exclude Indians by hiring this Japanese ship, and of course then ending up being unable to land and then being forcibly sent back to India. How, by the time you get to Canada, late 60s, early 70s, how much did that history weigh on the minds of Indian migrants? In other words, could you relate in your day-to-day lives and your day-to-day experience elements of that racism and exclusion that the Canadian state practiced 80 years earlier, or had life moved on and this was not so much a factor for you?
Life had changed, but there was no escaping the history, particularly for someone like me, because I went into a household, my aunt's household. Her grandfather-in-law was the General Secretary of the Ghadar Party of North America, on the west coast of US and Canada, which was active around the same time as the Kamagata Maru. Right. And so there was a treasure trove of historical documents that I had access to. I was very much more conscious than most of our history. But the discrimination had obviously diminished. We now had a right to vote starting in 1947, which had been taken away from us in 1907. We now had the right to profession and practice in professions like dentistry, medicine, law, engineering, which we didn't have before. And so Canada was more perfect than before, not completely perfect. And so it was a fertile ground for activism to make it better, and which was what people like me were doing before we were asked to run. But being on the West Coast, most people, and particularly someone like me who was very conscious of politics, of the independence movement, we were always conscious of the Kamagata Maru and the Ghadar Party, because my own Nana's chacha came at the call of the Ghadar party in 1914 to India and was hanged by the British in the Lahore conspiracy case. Right.
Lots of young men at the Kartar Singh Sraba, a lot of people came back and fought the British and paid with it for their lives.
So that was very close to my heart. And so for me, politics was elections or anything else was an extension of that kind of politics to move the society forward. And when I was asked to run, I thought about it for a while. I had just become a lawyer. I was poor.
This was in 79, you said, right?
Which is 79.
And with NDP, or had you moved to the Liberals by then?
No, I was still the NDP. Okay. Yeah, provincially I was always NDP.
Okay.
I'd married in 72, and I had 2 children, and the third came on just before the election in 79. But I ran, and I lost that election. The main reason I ran was the party convinced me that I had this unique experience of working with the farm workers, the janitorial workers, the domestic workers, and I was an immigrant of color, a person whose English wasn't the first language for me, and they felt that it was important for someone like me to run, and I felt so too, and that's how I came to run and lost the election, of course, and then ran another time, 83, sat out the 88 election because I had been then fighting the extremists around the question of Khalistan for several years, starting in 84. That took up essentially full-time work on my part as I was practicing law, and there was violence around that issue. I was the victim of that violence. But sort of we lived through that, and then finally, once again, under certain circumstances and persuasions, I decided to run again in 91, and won, and was the Attorney General of the province for 4.5 years, and the Premier for 1.5 years. Right. But when I ran, I never thought I'd win. If I won, I never thought I'd ever be in cabinet, let alone the Attorney General or the Premier. So from my perspective, politics was always something noble that you engaged in, not for being something, but for doing something.
Right. You have, you come and go in Punjab virtually every year. You have friends, relatives here. And I'm sure you're quite familiar with the way politics works in India.
Absolutely.
You know then that politics is a very expensive business here. If you want to stand for MLA-ship or MP-ship, you need to mobilize serious cash.
Absolutely.
What's the scene in BC or Canada? Can somebody with limited or even no resources contemplate entering electoral politics in Canada?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You can't contribute to your own campaign beyond a certain limit anyway. You can only contribute as much to your own campaign as anybody else can contribute to your campaign, which is limited by law.
These are limits to individual contributions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And there are no corporate contributions in certain jurisdictions, and most of the money came in hundreds or 250s from various donors. In my case, from BC, but also from all across Canada.
And would typically be tabulated and accounted? Would accounts be kept for that sort of thing?
Oh, of course.
Unlike here, where a donation of up to 20,000 rupees, quote unquote, need not be recorded even.
Every donation would be recorded except a donation below $10 or something. And then you'll have an election agent, candidate agent, who would be responsible for providing that account to the returning officer and to the electoral officer.
Right.
And people are prosecuted if there are errors in it.
Right. This takes us slightly away from where I thought we would go, but let me ask you for a 1-minute question, a 1-minute answer. Given the Indian preoccupation with the fight against black money, and clearly there is a link between politics and black money, would you say that the Canadian method of election finance and political expenditure is something that India ought to look at if it's serious about combating the influence of money power in general and black money on politics?
Absolutely. I mean, in Canada, you can't donate cash more than in 10s or 20s individually, and it has to be by a credit card or by a check, and it has to be registered and reported, and that's by law. And I think that India needs to put a limit on personal contributions or corporate contributions to elections, and make sure that each and every cent is reported.
Right. Does it disappoint you when you come back to, when you visit Punjab again, that immigration somehow never stopped? I mean, just as in the 60s, a young man like yourself felt compelled, based on his own circumstances and the perception of what was happening in the province and the country, that your future was in some sense, more secure if you went abroad. That desire, that desire to leave has remained pretty much constant. And even today, we hear stories of young men who feel they have no future within their environment, who want to get out, who want to leave the country. Does this worry you? Does it disappoint you?
Well, it worries me. It disappoints me to no end, because every third or every second young person in Punjab, I'm aware of Punjab, is waiting to just get out.
Yeah. Often at great personal expense. I mean,
yes,
nothing has changed to that extent.
And sometimes people die en route.
Yeah.
And that's very, very disheartening. I mean, some years ago, not to just talk of Punjab, some years ago when I visited here, there was a politician who was boasting how India was sending software programmers abroad, exporting them, which I thought was insulting to India and Indians, because here you are a relatively poor country, spend millions of dollars or rupees training your own people, and you can't deal with them inside the country, and then you're saying you take pride in exporting them. I mean, I thought that was the height of an insult.
Right. Turning back to Canada, if you take a long view, I mean, the Canada that you encountered in the 60s, that you, in a way, first embraced or got to know in the 70s, was really quite a different place from what Canada is today. I mean, the way in which Canada has embraced multiculturalism, whatever one may think of the concept, but certainly I get the sense that migrants from various parts of the world feel much more accepted and embraced in Canada than they would do, say, in Europe or in certain parts of the US.
True.
The Canadian attitude towards First Nations today is remarkable if you consider the kind of very, very dodgy treatment that extended even up to the 70s, when kids were being taken away and forcibly educated.
Absolutely.
What accounts for the evolution of Canada as a country that today is far more accepting of difference, revels in that difference? I mean, in India, we like to talk of ourselves as unity and diversity. Canada also has embraced that concept. What explains this? Is this the struggle of different sections for recognition? Is it just growing awareness among white Canadians that this is needed?
I think it's a struggle for recognition, obviously, but it's also a recognition by the majority that if you have substantial parts of your society that are less than equal, then society can't really be considered egalitarian. But it's also, sometimes human beings make a difference, leaders make a difference, and Pearson, that came before the elder Trudeau, brought in the Canada Pension Plan, the healthcare, and some of those universal programs that benefit people and make Canada a more just and fairer society. And then came the elder Trudeau in 1968. I got to Canada in May. He got elected as Prime Minister in June of 68, and his first election was in June of 68. And the vision, his vision was essentially encompassed in the phrase just society. He wanted to create a more just society. That was his slogan. And I think that was the foundation, and he opened up the doors to immigration. And that was the foundation of a more inclusive society. Right. And we've continued on that course with a slight fluctuation in the other direction with Mr. Harper. Right. Now with the younger Trudeau, we are on course to enhance that diversity.
And what better advertisement for Canada's reputation than the fact that immigration department servers in Canada crashed on the night of Donald Trump's victory. Ujjal, Dosanjh, we're completely out of time. It's been a great delight to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good seeing you.
Thank you. That wraps up this episode of Indian Standard Time. Do join us again next week with another guest. Thank you for watching.